What if I told you that some of the oldest texts on Earth don't just talk about gods, they talk about beings who came from the sky, ruled humanity, and decided its fate, not in myths, not in metaphors, but in detailed records, written on stone, thousands of years ago. So the question is not, who were the Anunnaki? The real question is, why did ancient people describe them as if they were real? Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. This channel is about slow, thoughtful explorations of history. No rush, no noise, just time, perspective, and questions. If that's something you enjoy, you're in the right place. Let's begin. Long before pyramids, before empires, before recorded history as we know it, there were stories. But not the kind told around fires. Not the kind meant to entertain. These were records, pressed into clay, carved into stone, hidden beneath sand for thousands of years, waiting. They were written by the Sumerians, one of the earliest civilizations ever discovered. And what they left behind was not poetry, not fantasy. It was administration, law, genealogy, decisions, real life. And inside these records, again and again, one name appears: the Anunnaki. Not introduced as legends, not introduced as imagination, but as authority, as rulers, as judges, as those who decided how the world would function. And that is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because ancient people did not describe the Anunnaki the way we describe fictional gods today. They did not say, "Once upon a time." They wrote as if these beings were part of their reality. Now, this raises a dangerous question. If these were only myths, why were they recorded like government documents? Why were their decisions written down? Why were their names attached to laws, cities, and bloodlines? Myths usually explain the unknown. But these texts don't feel like explanations. They feel like documentation. The Sumerians lived over 6,000 years ago. They invented writing. They created the first cities. They organized society. And they were not primitive. They tracked stars, mapped time, recorded history. So when they wrote about the Anunnaki, they didn't write in the language of fantasy. They wrote in the language of record keeping. They named them, categorized them, assigned them roles, and described their arrival from the sky. That phrase alone has fueled thousands of theories. From the sky. In ancient cultures, this often meant divine. But it also meant not from here. And that's where interpretations began to split. In Sumerian, the word Anunnaki is often translated as those who came from the heavens. But language is never simple. Heavens could mean sky, or space, or realm, or authority. What matters is not just the translation. It's the context. The texts say the Anunnaki were not distant. They were present. They gave commands. They argued. They punished. They rewarded. They made mistakes. They felt emotions. They were not described as perfect. And that alone makes them strange. Because most gods are flawless. These were not. And here is where history and mystery begin to separate. Because when modern scholars translated these texts, they called the Anunnaki gods. And for a while, that was enough. But then, some readers noticed something. The descriptions didn't sound symbolic. They sounded logistical, not spiritual, administrative, hierarchical, almost political. The Anunnaki were not a single being. They were a group, a system, a structure. Some ruled, some judged, some governed the underworld, some controlled fate. They had ranks. They had responsibilities. They had conflicts. This wasn't chaos. This was organization. And that should feel unsettling. Because myths usually don't care about structure. Reality does. So at this point in the story, we haven't proven anything. But we've also learned something important. The Anunnaki were not written as fantasy. They were written as power. And that forces us to ask, if they were only symbolic, why did ancient people describe them? Like rulers? And if they were not symbolic, then what were they? And that's where the story truly begins. We ended the last part with a question. Not an answer. Not a conclusion. Just a door. If the Anunnaki were not symbolic, then what were they? To understand that, we have to step away from theories and go back to where everything began. Not to the sky, not to the stars, but to the ground, to clay, to stone, to broken cities buried beneath time. Because before the Anunnaki became a mystery, they were simply a name written again and again, in the records of the Sumerians. Not in poems, not in songs, not in legends meant to entertain, but in lists, in laws, in lineages, in instructions. They did not introduce the Anunnaki with wonder. They introduced them with familiarity, as if everyone already knew who they were. And that is where things become strange. Because most myths explain. These texts assume. They do not ask who the Anunnaki were. They speak as if the reader already understands. As if their presence did not need justification, only documentation. And that changes everything. Because myths try to make sense of the unknown. But records exist to organize what is already real. They did not describe the Anunnaki as distant. They did not describe them as unreachable. They described them as present. Here. Involved. The texts speak of them the way you would speak of authority. Not with mystery, but with routine. They gave commands. They made decisions. They disagreed with one another. They punished. They rewarded. They were not perfect. And that detail matters. Because perfection belongs to myths. Flaws belong to reality. The Anunnaki were written as beings who argued. Who made mistakes? Who changed their minds? Who held grudges? They were not described as symbols of ideas. They were described as participants. And slowly, quietly, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. They were not one. They were many. A group. A structure. A system. Some ruled. Some judged. Some governed what came after death. Some decided the fate of cities. They had roles. They had responsibilities. They had hierarchy. This was not chaos. This was administration. And that word alone should make you pause. Because myths rarely care about structure. Reality does. Myths do not need organization. Societies do. So when modern scholars first translated these texts, they chose a word that felt safe. They called them gods. And for a long time, that word was enough. It placed the Anunnaki in a familiar category. Ancient people believed in gods. Gods controlled the world. Gods explained the unknown. End of story. Except, the descriptions didn't feel like belief. They felt like protocol. Not spiritual. Logistical. Not poetic. Administrative. They didn't sound like worship. They sounded like documentation. And that is where the split began. Because once you notice that difference, you can't unsee it. You begin to realize the Anunnaki were not written as mythology. They were written as governance. And that forces a new question. If they were gods, why were they described like officials? And if they were not gods, then what were they? And that is where the past refuses to stay in the past. To understand the Anunnaki, we need to talk about language. Because most of what we think we know about them comes from translation. And translation is never neutral. The word Anunnaki is usually explained as those who came from the heavens. And that sounds simple. Too simple. Because in ancient Sumerian, words did not carry only one meaning. They carried layers. Heavens did not mean only the physical sky. It could mean a realm, a domain, a place of authority, a level of command. Not above in distance, above in hierarchy. So when the texts say the Anunnaki came from the heavens, it does not automatically mean stars. It means from above, from a higher level, from a higher position in the system. And this is where confusion begins. Because modern readers hear from the sky and think of space. Ancient writers were not thinking about galaxies. They were thinking about structures. Structures of power. Structures of command. Structures of order. To them, above did not mean far. It meant superior. And that changes everything. Because now the question is no longer, did they come from outer space? But, were they written as beings who came from a higher level of authority? Higher than kings? Higher than cities? Higher than law? And that is where interpretation splits. Some scholars read these words symbolically. Others read them literally. And some believe the truth sits somewhere in between. But here is the important part. The Sumerians themselves did not write these words as riddles. They wrote them as facts. They did not pause to explain what heavens meant. They assumed the reader already knew. Which means this language was not poetic. It was functional. And that tells us something. When ancient cultures wrote poetry, they made it obvious. When they wrote myths, they made it dramatic. But these texts were neither. They were calm, precise, repetitive, like records. And then there is the name itself. Anunnaki. Often broken into parts. Anu, associated with authority and the highest domain. Na, Earth. Ki, Earth. Not simply sky beings, but those of Anu, who came to Earth. Or those from the highest domain, who had presence here. And again, The language is not clear. But the pattern is. They were not written as distant. They were written as present. Not in stories. In systems. They appear in lists. In hierarchies. In instructions. They were not introduced. They were referenced. And that distinction matters. Because myths introduce. Records reference. And this is where the meaning begins to shift. We are not looking at stories about beings far away. We are looking at descriptions of beings who were part of how things worked, part of how cities functioned, part of how decisions were made, part of how the world was ordered. And this creates a tension. Because if these were only metaphors, then the Sumerians built entire systems of law, power, and structure on symbolic language. And that would be strange. But if they were not metaphors, then what were they? At this point, history begins to blur into something else. Not belief, not certainty, but interpretation. And interpretation is dangerous, because it does not ask, what is true? It asks, what is possible? And once that question appears, it does not disappear. It waits. And that is where the next layer of the story begins. At some point, the story reaches a place where it can no longer stay simple. Once you accept the possibility that the Anunnaki were written as something real, not imagined, not symbolic, but present in the way daily life is present, the questions begin to change. They stop being poetic. They become practical. How real were they? What kind of presence did they have? Were they political? Religious? Social? Were they rulers, advisors, or something more abstract than any of those? This is where the story takes a strange turn. Not because of what the ancient texts say, but because of how we, much later, began to read them. At a certain point in modern history, people stopped asking what these texts meant in their own time, and started asking what they might mean to us. And that shift changed everything. The Anunnaki were no longer treated as part of an ancient worldview. They became part of a modern one, connected to questions about power, about control, about where humanity came from, and about what might exist beyond it. Not because the tablets demanded this interpretation, but because our imagination did. Once the Anunnaki became part of the modern imagination, the questions began to multiply. People stopped reading the tablets as historical records, and started reading them as clues. Not about the past, but about something hidden, something advanced, something intentional. In the 20th century, new ideas entered the world. Space travel, genetic science, lost civilizations. And suddenly, ancient texts felt unfinished. Some readers began to wonder if the Anunnaki were not metaphors at all, but descriptions of beings more advanced than the people who wrote about them. Not divine in a spiritual sense, but technological. Not eternal, but superior. From that moment, the story changed direction. The Anunnaki were no longer rulers of myth. They became engineers, architects, designers of early humanity. And with that shift, history stopped being history. It became speculation. But speculation has a strange power. It doesn't ask what happened. It asks what could have happened. And that single difference is enough to rewrite everything. By this point, the story has split into two directions. One moves toward imagination. The other moves toward evidence. And this is where scholars step in. Not to kill the mystery, but to slow it down, to separate what the texts actually say from what we wish they said. Because when historians and linguists study Sumerian tablets, they do not read them as messages. They read them as systems. They look at how words are used, where they appear, what surrounds them, what kind of documents they are written in. And what they found was not cosmic. It was administrative. The Anunnaki appear in economic records, in temple archives, in legal texts, in genealogies, in instructions. They are mentioned the way institutions are mentioned, the way authority is referenced, the way structure is maintained. Not with awe, not with fear, but with routine. And that matters. Because if these texts were trying to describe visitors from another world, they would not sound this ordinary. They would not be so repetitive, so procedural, so dry. Most of the time, they are not telling stories. They are organizing life. Who owns what? Who answers to whom? Who has the right to decide? Who has the power to punish? Who has the authority to bless? In that sense, the Anunnaki function more like a system than like characters. They are not individuals with personalities. They are positions, roles, titles. This is why scholars hesitate when people call them gods. Because that word brings expectations, miracles, worship, mysticism. But the texts themselves do not behave that way. They behave like governance. They describe order, responsibility, hierarchy, procedure. They describe a world that is being managed, not enchanted. And this is where disappointment often enters. Because the academic explanation is quieter. It does not promise secrets. It does not promise hidden truths. It does not promise visitors from the stars. It promises context. And context is rarely dramatic. But it is powerful. Because when we look at these tablets in their real historical setting, we see something remarkable. Not advanced beings, but an advanced society. One that understood organization, time, law, economy, social roles. One that built systems long before we gave those systems names. And maybe that is what feels unsettling. Not that they were visited, but that they were already capable, already structured, already complex, already modern in ways we do not expect. So the academic view does not erase the Anunnaki. It transforms them from mysteries into mechanisms, from beings into functions, from stories into structure. And that leads to a quieter question. Not, were they real? But, what does it say about us that we want them to be more than they were? Because sometimes, we do not search the past for answers. We search it for wonder. And when we do, we often find exactly what we are looking for. Not because it is there, but because we needed it to be. And so, we arrive at the quietest part of this story. Not an answer. Not a revelation. But a mirror. Because after everything we've seen, the myths, the records, the interpretations, the theories, one truth becomes difficult to ignore. The Anunnaki tell us less about themselves, and more about us. About how we react to the unknown. About how uncomfortable we are with complexity. About how quickly we replace uncertainty with imagination. We want clear villains, clear gods, clear origins, But history is rarely that kind. It is slow, fragmented, incomplete. It leaves gaps. And humans have always filled gaps with stories. Not because we are foolish, but because we are meaning-seeking. When the past becomes quiet, we make it speak. When it becomes distant, we bring it closer. When it becomes unclear, we turn it into something familiar. And so, the Anunnaki became more than they were. Not because the tablets demanded it, but because we did. Because we needed mystery. Because we needed wonder. Because we needed to believe that something greater had shaped us. But maybe the greater story is simpler. Maybe what is truly astonishing is not that someone came from the stars, but that humans, thousands of years ago, built order out of chaos, law out of instinct, time out of movement, society out of survival. Maybe the real miracle was never in the sky, but here. And that leaves us with one final question. Not about the Anunnaki, but about ourselves. When we look into the past, what are we really searching for? Truth? Or meaning? And if you've reached this moment, you're part of the question now. So tell me, when you look into the past, what are you hoping to find? Write it in the comments. One sentence. No explanations.